Good morning, American History 2 students. This is week 30. This week we're going to be looking at Woodrow Wilson's second term as president, World War I and how it affected America, women's rights, and a comparison of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. I do realize the microphone is weird and I have like a second weird robo voice. I'm sorry for that. I have no way to change the audio quality or to fix that right now. I have ordered a microphone that should fix the problem, but due to the pandemic, it is not here yet. As soon as it's here, hopefully we can have better audio quality. I do need everyone to check in so that I can see that everyone is present and accounted for my class. So if you will just put a comment over to the side on the live chat, I want you to comment the two main factors that we talked about last week briefly that are going to pull the U.S. into the war. You need to put both of them down in your comments. It's very important that you do that. If you do not comment, I will assume that you were not here at class, and I will be informing your parents. So please make sure you leave those comments on the side there in the live chat. I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit to do that. If you can't remember, just comment, can't remember, or if you don't have your notes, just comment, don't have my notes, but please leave a comment so that I do know you're present. Thank you. All right, first we're going to be looking at Woodrow Wilson's second term as president. His second term is going to be mostly marked by World War I, obviously, and then all the efforts he's going to put into peace. He's going to put a lot of his effort into peace. He really wants peace, and he really wants certain ideas that he has surrounding peace to come to fruition. But we're going to see a lot of those ideas not happen, especially here in the U.S. We're also going to see some other things happen with him. We're going to see the start of the Red Scare, and we're going to see prohibition and women's suffrage. And, of course, we're going to look a little bit more at women's suffrage today. I put off us looking at prohibition just due to the fact that it plays a massive part in the Roaring Twenties due to people's desire to go a little wild and all the speakeasies and everything. So we'll look at that more when we get into the Roaring Twenties with our next lesson. So April 2nd, 1917, Wilson addresses Congress asking for a declaration of war against Germany. Now this is like 4 months or 5 months, give or take, depending on when you want to look at it, because the election was in November, so I guess 5 months, since Wilson has been reelected after he ran on a platform of he kept us out of the war. That was Wilson's running platform. He kept us out of the war. And we're going to see with this that he's no longer keeping us out of the war. We're entering it right away. But of course, we're entering it because we really had no choice after the sinking of our ships and Germany trying to pull Mexico to fight us to get them to take our attention away from what's going on in Europe. We really have no choice. Now, if you can remember the main ship that got sunk by the German U-boats and the name of what clued us into what Germany was trying to do with Mexico, that's what should be in the comment that I asked you to leave earlier. Okay, April 2nd, 1917 is pretty also impressive because we see Jeannette Rankin get to be a person in the House. She's the first woman to be serving, a first woman representative, so that's really big. It's a big step for women, even though women are working at this point and do have lives outside of the home. Like, this is super important. April 4th, 1917, the U.S. declares war on Germany. So after Wilson addressed Congress, they thought about it, and then they said, yeah, you know what, we need to go to war against Germany. So this is the official declaration of war against them. April 14th, 1917, the Committee on Public Information is created. Now, we don't like this committee. This committee is not... it's not American. I don't want to say it. I feel bad saying it like that. But it's going to be heavily affecting what Americans are able to say. It's going to try to affect what Americans are thinking. We'll look at that a little bit more when we get into more about the war, but it's just not, it's a massive influence on public speech when two of the acts they're going to release, and one more than the other, or play a part in, which is going to be the Sedition Act, which huge limit of free speech. But they also are big on propaganda. They are the ones that are going to push out all the propaganda that's going to keep people like wanting to be in the war and pro-war, you know. So we don't really like them. April 24th, 1917, Liberty Loan Drive occurs. So the Liberty Loan Drive is a big deal because that's basically the American government getting itself kind of in debt, sort of. So it's handing out bonds called Liberty Bonds that you could purchase. So give your money to U.S. for the U.S. to use to build up their war supplies for the war effort. May 18th, 1917, we have Selective Service Act, also the draft. There was a conscription act during the Civil War, but that was a little bit more optional, and you could also pay your way out of it if you had money. That there's not going to be any way to pay your way out of this. So what happened is anyone, I think 18 to 60 was the age gap. You put your name on a piece of paper. You turn the piece of paper in. I mean, I don't know that it was a piece of paper, but you get my drift. And then that piece of paper was pulled out of the hat. So. Okay, May 15th, 1917, the Espionage Act goes into effect. This is a no spying act. So if you're caught spying on the U.S., we think that there's any chance that you're going to betray U.S. interests, we can arrest you, and we will arrest you. And generally, we'll punish you, and generally that punishment was jail time. Excuse me. June 26, 1917, the first of the U.S. troops arrive in France. Those were basically our standing troops that we have in time of peace, which at that point in time I think were 200,000 men that were trained and ready to fight. And of course we need a lot more than that, and we will end up getting a lot more than that. But these are the first troops arriving in France. September 5th, 1917, Industrial Workers of the World raids. So that was IWW, which was a union, and they were raided, and several people were arrested on September 5th. November 3rd, 1917, the first fight in the war with U.S. forces at the Rhine River. There's going to be several smaller fights, but we will talk about the massive ones that I think are most important when we get more into the war. November 6th, 1917, women win the right to vote. Now, the right to vote it's not the amendment. We haven't got the amendment, but people are saying, yes, women should have the right to vote. And a lot of states are jumping on board, but it's still not official yet. November 30th, 1917, the 42nd Rainbow Division arrives in France. The Rainbow Division was named such because all the people came from all over the U.S., so it was like a rainbow of people that stretched across the whole of the U.S. December 18th, 1917, the 18th Amendment is introduced. This amendment is obviously prohibition. It prohibits the sale and purchase of alcohol. We're going to see a lot of pushback on this amendment, and of course, we'll look at that a little bit more later because that's a pretty big deal. The prohibition is a big deal. January 8th, 1918, Wilson's 14th point speech is given by Woodrow Wilson. This speech is the cornerstone for what Wilson wants as peace. Those 14 points, we're going to look at them a little bit later, but that's going to massively impact Woodrow Wilson's works with peace. But not everyone agrees with his 14 points, and we'll see that later on. January 26, 1918, the head of the Food Administration, which was created during this wartime by Wilson's team, and the head of it is a man named Hoover. He calls for food conservation, also known as rationing. And so he tries to introduce days where you don't eat certain things, tells you to have your own garden, tells you to not eat things that can be sent to troops overseas. So it's rationing. kind of similar to what we're seeing now, where stores are telling people that they cannot buy more than 2 of something during this pandemic. If you go to a store right now during this pandemic, you will see a lot of stores saying you can only buy 2 of items. But that's not because necessarily we are lacking in the items or we're low on the items. It's more because people are panic buying and they're trying to kind of control that. May 16th, 1918, the Sedition Act is passed. This massively limits free speech. So this is the act that we really hate. This was a dark time in American history with this Sedition Act because it's violating our right to freedom of speech, freedom of press. It's no anti-war propaganda should be written or spoken about. If you present super anti-war ideas or opinions, we can arrest you. And we're going to see somebody get arrested because of this act. Post offices shouldn't distribute anti-war anything. Like, very much a freedom of a limiting of a freedom of speech and a limiting of a freedom of press, which bad. Because as soon as you start to limit freedom of speech and freedom of press, it's very easy for the government to gain more control over you than you want them to. May 29th, 1918, War Industries Board is created. This was a board that figured out how to make weapons and make them as quickly and as efficiently as possible and get them overseas as quickly and efficiently as possible to help out the troops on the front line. June 4th, 1918, U.S. forces hold back German forces at Chateau Thierry. June 6, 1918, U.S. forces counter German forces at the Battle of Bellewood. August 29th, 1918, cost of living in New York has jumped 17% from July 1917, which that's a pretty big jump, but part of that jump was due to the fact that wages doubled, and when wages go up, the price of your goods go up. So right now it's a debate that they want a living wage for minimum wage people. I did quotations around that, and not because I don't think people deserve to be paid fairly for what they do, but at the same time, you have to be aware that a lot of times when prices go up, like when wages go up, prices go up. So if minimum wage goes up, the price of goods is going to go up, and that living wage will no longer be a living wage. September 14th, 1918, Eugene Debs is sentenced to 10 years in prison for breaking the Sedition Act. September 3rd, and Eugene Debs was a socialist. I think we mentioned him last week. He was very anti-war, and so he had 2 things against him right there. People are getting more and more afraid of socialism and communism, and we're going to see that in 1920, which is only a couple years away, with the Red Scare, which we'll look at in a later lesson in more detail. But he's also very anti-war, which Wilson was trying at all costs to avoid that kind of thought right now, so he does get arrested. September 30th, 1918, Wilson defends women's right to vote to the U.S. Senate. So Wilson was very pro-women's suffrage, but so was Teddy Roosevelt. Even though we didn't see women get suffrage under Teddy Roosevelt, he was pro-women getting the right to vote. He was a big supporter of that. And Wilson is too. And Wilson's going to use women's efforts in the war, both at home and not on the front lines, but like overseas in Europe, to kind of push through the women's right to vote. October 1918, global influenza, or the Spanish flu pandemic, is at its height. So it's ironic that we're learning about this time in history when there was another pandemic going on. At the height of this pandemic, we had 600,000 cases in the U.S. alone. It was a massive pandemic. A lot of people died. It was bad news. November 9th, but we didn't social distance like we are now. November 9th, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates the throne after revolution breaks out in Germany. So this is basically where we're starting to see the end of the war. November 11th, 1918, Allied and German forces armistice, so that's where they're meeting for peace. November 18th, 1918, Wilson announced the Paris Peace Conference. So he's going to go overseas and like have a major part in the peace conference. That is not going to be supported by a lot of Americans. They are going to be very much like, why are you going overseas? You should stay here. You know, we don't have anything to do with them, really. You know, we joined the war because our people were threatened, not because Europe was having issues. So that's people are very anti that. November 21st, 1918, Wartime Prohibition Act is passed. This is a temporary act that's going to just not allow the selling of alcohol or the buying of alcohol until Wilson can fully pass that prohibition with the 18th Amendment, because that has not been ratified yet. We're going to see it in just a little bit be ratified, though. February 18, 1919, the Paris Peace Conference opens. February 29, 1919, the 18th Amendment is ratified, so that means the 18th Amendment goes into effect. No more alcohol for the people of the U.S., not just dry states and wet states, just no more alcohol whatsoever. February 14th, 1919, Wilson presents the League of Nations draft. March 3rd, 1919, Schneck versus the U.S. backs up the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. May 19th, 1919, the 19th Amendment is introduced to the Senate, and well, to Congress as a whole, to the Senate and the House. It's introduced, and of course, we're going to see it pass through, but it has not passed yet. Not officially. It hasn't gone through officially yet. July 10th, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles is signed and the creation of the League of Nations. August 31st, 1919, the Communist Labor Party of America is founded in Chicago. Oh, we're seeing communism and socialism over here in the U.S. Warning bells, people are not liking communism. Communism has taken over in Russia at this point, and we're seeing a lot of drawbacks to it. And people are going to panic, and we're going to see that more in the 20s. But people really do not want communism over here, and we still, I'm not generally one to tell you what you should or should not want politically, but communism has failed. It has always failed. It's a lovely idea in practice, but it never really works in theory because people are greedy. It's just the way it is. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And communism just really makes there be only two classes, upper elite and then the lower class. And it kind of gets rid of the middle class. And the big thing about the U.S. is that we have a middle class, even though our middle class is crippled right now. So communism would kind of crush that. And that's a huge reason that people panic about it here in the 1920s coming up. And we're going to see that with the Red Scare. September 4th, 1919, Wilson embarks on a nationwide tour to talk about the peace conference and to advocate for his League of Nations. His League of Nations is his big thing. Like, he's very much like, gotta get this through, gotta get this through. And unfortunately, the League of Nations is a touchy subject. I'm not going to say one way or another whether or not we should have been a part of the League of Nations, but it just depends on how you feel about it, but we do not ever end up joining the League of Nations. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. This is the last part. This is the second term, part 2. September 9th, 1919 is the Boston police strike, so the people of Boston kind of just walk out. October 28th, the police people, not just the people of Boston. October 28th, 1919, Volstead Act to enforce the 18th Amendment is passed over Wilson's veto. So that Volstead Act just kind of cracks down on prohibition, makes things even more strict. And Wilson vetoes it, but it's passed anyways, because you can supersede a president's veto. It was a safe put in place by our founders. November 1919, the Treaty of Versailles fails in the Senate, 53 to 38. More specifically, the League of Nations fails. October 7th, 1919 through May 1920, the Red Scare raids. So those raids on communism, that scary, oh my god, communism, is gonna, those raids are gonna, the main part of those raids is gonna happen right around then. And we'll look at that more next week. March 19th, 1920, the Treaty of Versailles is defeated in the Senate again. This time it was defeated, this defeat was supported by Wilson because the treaty had been taken and the League of Nations had been taken and had been messed with by another man, and Wilson hated what he had done with it and was like, no, don't support it. And we'll look at that when we get into the war. April 1st, 1920, U.S. withdraws from Siberia. If you remember from last week, we had sent troops over there to kind of help with the political unrest going on over there. April 15th, 1920, Sacco and Vazici murder case. And we'll talk more about that next week. May 20th, 1920, Wilson vetoes the end of the war. So the Congress is going to declare the war over, and Wilson vetoes it because the treaty and the League of Nations hasn't been ratified, hasn't been passed. And so our peace with Germany is going to be really on unstable ground because that treaty and that League of Nations is never going to pass over here in the U.S. at any point. So June 8th, 1920, Republicans nominate Warren G. Harding for president. June 28th, 1920, Democrats nominate James Koch and Franklin Delano Roosevelt for president and vice president. August 18th, 1920, the 19th Amendment is officially ratified, which means women have gained the right to vote. And it was a long-fought battle there. August 28th, 1920, Harding denounces the League of Nations. He's like, no, the League of Nations is not a good thing. We don't need to be a part of it. Just no. November 2nd, 1920, Warren G. Harding is elected president, kind of from running on that the League of Nations is not a good thing. And also he runs on the platform of let's return to normalcy. Like, let's make things normal again. And again, remember, we see times of boom after a war, and then we'll kind of go back into an economic depression of some sort. But this is a massive election, like a really important election, because it's the first election when women were voting. November 20th, 1920, Wilson wins the Nobel Peace Prize for his attempts, his work over in Europe with the war. January 13th, 1921, Census Bureau report states that 51 of Americans now live in the city. So we have become more industrialized and we have become a farm country. And if you remember, that's what the parties have been divided on for so long, is whether we should be industrial or whether we should be farm-based. And that's still a debate today. A lot of people that do farming are kind of actually looked down on. So, and we're also having a census this year, too. So, see, history always repeats itself. All right, I'm going to go on to the next slide. So, the start of World War I. There are several things that are building in Europe that are building Europe up to World War I. Now, I'm not going to do an in-depth, super detailed look at World War I. I'm going to put two video links in the description, and I will remember to put these two links down there. I only put the one last week, but that's because I couldn't really find anything good for the other things that I said I was going to put, and I had already recorded that. But I know about these videos already. I have them waiting to be put in the description as I record this. They take a more broad look and a bit more detailed look at all the fighting going on in Europe. This is American history, so we're going to be focused a little bit more on Americans' part in the war. But I do need to get you to understand what's going on in Europe so you can understand Americans' part in the war and how we got involved and all that fun stuff. The first thing that's building up to this war in Europe is imperialism. Countries competing for who can be the biggest and the best. They're taking colonies, like they're creating colonies all across the globe, and they're fighting for territories, and it's basically just I've got a bigger horse than you mentality. Militarism, also known as the arms race. And we're going to see this happen and continue to happen throughout history. But we're really going to see the arms race is what it was called with the Cold War. We were having another arms race. We're also having a space race during the Cold War. And we'll look more at that when we get to that in the lessons. Aggressive nationalism was the third thing. So this is nationalism gone bad. Nationalism, as a general rule, is not bad. It's pride in your country. It's pride where you came from. It's pride in your culture. It's supporting your culture. America, 4th of July. We are known as a very nationalistic country. Aggressive nationalism is when you have the belief that your country is the best country, and your country can fix all other countries' problems, and your country should be in control of all the other countries because your country's the best. And America gets this to a certain degree, but not to the degree that we are talking about in this lesson as far as in Europe goes. This aggressive nationalism, it was more a drive and a desire to take control and to wipe out other countries rather than just, well, we can fix all your problems. It was you won't have any problems because now you're going to be of our country. This was specifically a big deal with Germany and France. And as you can see on the slide, the arms race was this big deal between Britain and Germany. They were both really building up their fleets, actually. And Britain, was known to have the biggest fleet in Europe at the time, which makes sense because they're an island. But Germany's building up a pretty massive fleet to contend with Britain. Okay, and then number 4, we have the secret alliances between countries. And there are 3 true alliances at this point. We've got the Pan-Slavic or Pan-Slavism alliance, which is Serbia, Russia, Romania, and other Balkan countries. So they are all aligned, hey, we're Slavic, we're not Austrian-Hungary, we're not German, we're Slavic. And they're kind of rebelling against Austria-Hungary, a lot of them, and wanting their own territory and their own their independence, basically. Then we have the Triple Entente, the Triple Entente, which is Russia, France, and Great Britain. And then we have the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Now, just because we have all these alliances right here going into this doesn't mean that these alliances are going to last. Now, a lot of them will last, but you'll see what I mean as we go on. The spark that lit the fuse officially of World War I was the assassination of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, on June 28, 1914. He wasn't the only one that was killed. His pregnant wife was also killed during the assassination. And they were both killed in Serbia by a group known as the Black Hand, which was an aggressive nationalism group for Serbian independence. So Serbia had declared its independence from Austria-Hungary, and it was an independent country at this point, but Austria-Hungary likes to push boundaries, and so they sent troops in to Serbia to train in the mountains, and Archduke Franz Ferdinand was there to oversee it, and there was a parade thrown for him when he came in. And the aggressive nationalisms were not happy about it, and so that they are the ones that attempted to assassinate him. And they're really bad at it, too, because, they sent bombs, they throw bombs at his car, but, one just misses and doesn't go off, and another one goes into the car, but it gets thrown out and it doesn't go off, and then another one misses again, but it does go off, and it blows up Franz Ferdinand's officers that were behind him. And then later, he gets shot in the head by a specific man, which we're going to see down here. So Austria-Hungary, or AH, it's going to be on the slide. So if you see AH, think Austria-Hungary, is understandably upset. But they are even more upset than you would realize, because Archduke Ferdinand was the heir apparent to the throne, which means he was eventually supposed to take over Austria-Hungary. And now that can't happen. So they're really bad. So Austria-Hungary issues an ultimatum to Serbia. And so this is what you must do, and you must let us do, or else we're going to declare war on you, Serbia. And Serbia, like, if you're looking at a world map, which you're probably not as I'm speaking this, and I should have put one on the screen, but I didn't think about it. Austria-Hungary was this, think Germany-sized country. I will try to include a link to a map in the description. But it was a relatively large-sized country, and Serbia was not. It was a smaller little country that was right next to Austria-Hungary, and it was a relatively new country. So Serbia is not going to stand much of a chance on its own if Austria-Hungary declares war on it. But Austria-Hungary's demands were impractical, and the demands in the ultimatum are down here. So first, Austria-Hungary will run the investigation into who shot the Archduke. Even though Serbia had already taken control of this, they had arrested right away the man that did it, Gavrilo Principali, GP there. And several other black hands, and they had sentenced the other people to death, but GP was underage, so he was just sentenced to 10 years in prison, although he does die in prison from tuberculosis. But they had that well under control, but Austria-Hungary is like, no, you're going to let us come in and take care of it. 2, Serbia must suppress all anti-Austria-Hungary propaganda. So no freedom of speech, no freedom of press. If you say anything anti-Austria-Hungary, we're done with you. You're going down. 2, Serbia must suppress. I'm sorry, I said that already. 3, Serbia had to hunt down and eliminate all anti-Austria-Hungary terrorist groups. So not just the black hands had to be eliminated, but anyone who might be too nationalistic to Serbia needed to be hunted down and eliminated. Of course, Serbia's like, and so Austria-Hungary says, war on you, Serbia. And then Serbia goes, okay, hey, allies. And so I'm going to go on to the next slide, and we're going to look at how the chips are going to fall with all those alliances, although you should probably have a good idea at this point. So, with war on, we see the alliances come into play. Serbia pulls in Russia because of the Pan-Slavic alliance. Remember where we had all those Slavic countries connected with Russia? Yes. Serbia goes, hey, Russia, it's a power. And then Russia's going to pull in France because of the Triple Entente. Now, Britain is a part of the Triple Entente, but they're kind of like on the side, on the fence here, going like, I don't know if I want to get involved in this. But we're going to see them get pulled in too for different reasons. So Austria-Hungary's like, I need backup. They pull in Germany, who's right next to Austria-Hungary on the map, and because of their triple alliance they have. And they knew that Serbia was going to call in Russia because they knew Serbia was too small to really do anything. And then they knew Russia was going to call in France. And then France and Russia were on either side of Germany. So Germany's like, oh, I got to get involved in this because I don't want to lose out on the action and I don't want to be invaded. So basically it's like a bunch of dominoes are falling right now. And remember these secret alliances, and there's quotations around that secret because they weren't really secret. People knew who was aligned with who. Even if nobody outright said, by the way, I'm with so-and-so. Okay. When Germany, I'm sorry. Other countries are going to be pulled in, and we're going to see those, and those are highlighted down at the bottom. But those are the original countries that are going to fight. Austria-Hungary's attacking Serbia. Russia's attacking Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary brought in Germany, so Russia's also now attacking Germany. And Russia has pulled in France, who's also going to attack Germany, and Austria-Hungary to a lesser extent. So that's it. Serbia, Russia, France on one side. Austria-Hungary, Germany on the other side. Well, that's not going to be it for long. Germany, there's a defensive line on the border between France and Germany on France's side. France is really defense, like they've set up their defenses really well. So Germany had a plan, which we're going to look at in a little bit, the Schlieffen plan, and they needed to take over France as quickly as possible. So instead of attacking that defensive line, Germany's like, nope, we're going to go around. If you go around, they have to go through neutral Belgium. And Belgium's like, excuse me, no, I'm neutral. I don't want to be involved in this. Don't get me involved in this. You can't come in here. And Germany's like, we're going to come in anyways. Just sit down and shut up, Belgium, and let us come through. But Belgium's like, no, I'm neutral, but you're making me not be neutral. So Belgium's actually going to fight against Germany. And then this is going to pull Great Britain into the war. Great Britain actually did issue their own ultimatum to Germany, and they said, hey, Germany, if you go into Belgium to do this campaign, if you invade Belgium, we're going to get involved. And Belgium ignored their ultimatum, and so Great Britain's now involved in the war. So by the end of the war, we're going to have seen two sides of the war develop. And these are just falling into play as the party keeps going, basically. So as the fighting continues, other countries are kind of watching how things are falling, and then they're kind of jumping in. They're like, hey, I put my name with this side. So we're going to have the Central Powers. These are the bad guys. That's why they're in red. Austria-Hungary, Germany, Turkey, also the Ottoman Empire. That's what they were then, modern-day Turkey, and Bulgaria. So these are the Central Powers. There are going to be a couple of other countries that do come into play, but they're not major. These are the major Central Power players. The Allies' major players are going to be France, Russia, Great Britain, Japan, Greece, and the U.S. Japan and Greece are a little bit later, but the U.S. is a lot later. We're only in the war for about 4 or 5 months. So the U.S. is. So there are some other countries that are going to come in also on the side of the Allied major powers, but again, they're not as big a deal as the ones that are listed there in green, because they're the good guys. So green means go, red means stop. We don't like the reds, we like the greens. So Italy started out on the side of the Central Powers, but then later Italy changes sides and goes to the Allies. And it's like, hey, Allies, we're friends, right? Notice who's not on the list. Serbia, the one who started this whole mess, the first domino to fall, is not on the list. They don't do a lot in the war, and nothing really happens with them. So they're on the Allied side, but they're not going to do a lot, which is why they're not on the list. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next slide. Massive changes to the way the war is fought, to the way war is fought as a whole. So not just to the way that the war is fought, but to the way that warfare happens in general. So all countries involved in this war had to rethink the way they did war. No more old war style. So things were very more gentle. They were more a gentlemanly way. The U.S. kind of broke that with the Civil War. If you remember when we talked about that, we said how they thought that was one of the most brutal wars in history, and they thought that was going to kind of be the end of that style of fighting, but it's really not. It was the start, and that's going to be the main way we see fighting from now on. And it's not gentlemanly anymore. It's not. We line up and we fire at someone, and in neat little lines, and we do cavalry charges and bayonet charges. Instead, it's we fight dirty, and we have a lot of weapons of mass destruction that we're going to be using. Many countries also had to change their uniform as they stood out too easily, or their uniforms didn't protect them properly. For example, France wore a bright blue uniform with bright red pants that could easily be spotted. Neither France nor Russia nor Britain had helmets at first, and I think, was it Great Britain that didn't have boots? I think it might have been Great Britain that didn't have, somebody didn't have boots on the Allied side, so had to rethink that. Weapons and other crafts, such as Zeppelin and U-boats, are going to make the war a lot more devastating than ever before. We're seeing the start of bomb drops with Zeppelins. The Germans are going to do that on British cities. We're seeing the start of submarine warfare with torpedoes and sneaky ships. The Germans are going to do that against the Allies. So it can get confusing because the Allies originally were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, but then they become the Central Powers. So from now on, I will be referring to that group of people as the Central Powers, and I will be referring to the Allies as Great Britain, France, Russia, U.S., and so on. Okay. So, and then we're going to see the use of tanks on both sides, which is going to be. And there's a huge new, there are huge new battleships too that Britain and Germany have, but they're not going to play much. They're not going to really play much of a role in this war. Also machine guns, and not like the handheld machine guns, although we are going to see at one battle, we are going to see a handheld machine gun come into play, but generally with these massive, massive guns that had to be operated by multiple people, and they were more similar to our modern mounted machine guns. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. World War I in the water. So remember, this battle is fought not only on land, but also in the water, and slightly in the air, but not really. We're going to see more air warfare come into play during World War II, because planes were not really used for flight or for traveling people, and it's not as much in the air. I mean, we do have Zeppelins dropping bombs. So if you want to look at that as air warfare, then you can, but I haven't included that in here. It's more in the water and on land. So World War I in the water, Great Britain had the largest fleet in Europe, and they were using it to their advantage. They blockaded Germany, so no ships could get supplies to them, and none of Germany's ships could leave their port. So there was a blockade. And if you know how Great Britain is up, and then Europe is down here, and Germany's over by this coast, like, it was pretty easy for them to just create a blockade and be like, nope, kick it out. That blockade doesn't last, though, when Germany starts using U-boats. We call them submarines today. Those underwater ships. Because of those U-boats, Germany was able to start fighting this war out in the ocean. At this time, there was no technology to find or to destroy the U-boats. Even if you found one, you couldn't destroy it. And you just had to wait and let it torpedo you. Germany has promised not to attack any neutral ships at all. But Great Britain and France kind of used this and changed their ships to look like American ships, because remember, America starts off this war as neutral and is like, no, we're not getting involved in this. And Germany catches on that Great Britain and France has done that, and then they're like, well, we're going to start hitting American quotation ships, but they actually are going to hit a few actual American ships in this process of trying to get France and Great Britain ships that have disguised themselves as American ships. A little bit on in the war, Germany also starts sinking non-war ships, meaning passenger liners. Think Titanic. The most notable of these ships that are going to be sunk is the Lusitania. Although Germany will sink two other, when it says more important, it doesn't mean they're more important than the Lusitania. It's just two more. One thought there. Important passenger ships. The Arabic, which is a Great Britain ship, and the Sussex, which is a French ship. And we mentioned the Sussex last week because after the sinking of the Sussex ship, Germany issues the Sussex Promise, which is a promise that they're not going to sink any more passenger liners, but they are going to, of course, break that promise later on. We'll see. So the biggest ship we're going to talk about that they sink right now is going to be the Lusitania. So this was a sister ship to the Titanic, very luxurious. This ship went from Great Britain to the U.S., specifically New York. And then it's supposed to come back from the U.S. to Great Britain. Germany warns the U.S. that they are going to go after the ship. And some Americans listen, and so they don't get on the ship. Others don't listen, and they do get on the ship. And so we've got the ship full of its people heading to Great Britain from New York when it's off the coast of Ireland, off the southern tip. A German U-boat sees it. They fire one torpedo. It misses, but Lusitania can't do anything about it. They know they're just sitting ducks now. The U-boat fires a second torpedo. It hits. And do you remember how long it took the Titanic to sink? We talked about that last week. Put that over in the comments and the live questions if you remember, or take a guess at how long you think it took the Titanic to sink. Have you written down how long it took the Titanic to sink yet? Yeah, 2.5 almost hours did it take the Titanic to sink after it hit an iceberg. This ship sinks in 18 minutes. 18 minutes! It's a long time. They theorize that maybe it sank that fast because it might have been holding cargo that was ammunition that exploded after it got hit by the torpedo, but we're not certain. 1,198 people are dead. 128 of those people are Americans, so this is a big deal. It's a big deal on the American population. Like, it gets the American people being like, I think war. We need to go to war now. And Wilson's still very much anti-war, so at this point he's like, no, we're not going to war over this. But he does issue a declaration to Germany, and Wilson says, Germany, if you do anything else to piss us off, you do one more thing that makes us mad, we're going to break diplomatic relations. So no longer will they be friends with Germany, and that's basically a prelude to war. Like, war's on the horizon if that happens. A few people did survive this, by the way. They were able to swim to shore, to Ireland's shore. And a few people on Ireland did see this happen and did send out ships to try to help who they could. But again, it sunk so fast that there was just no help, really. By 1915, Germany sinks 90 ships with their U-boats. 90 ships! Just in 1915. That's a lot. Oh, and by the way, that declaration by Wilson about diplomatic relations being ended, that's what prompted the Sussex Promise. Of course, again, we're gonna see them not follow through on that. There was only truly one naval battle, however. So if you remember in your history classes from other people or from before, there would be naval battles. In fact, we had some in the Spanish-American War where ships, like big ships, are fighting against each other. I mentioned earlier that they had these big new ships called the dreadnoughts. These were cost a lot of money to build. And Great Britain had some and Germany had some. And because they cost so much, neither were really willing to use them. But they did use them in one battle, but neither side won in that battle. And the ships on both sides, expensive ships, ended up getting damaged. And Germany and Great Britain were like, never mind, we're not going to do anything else with our dreadnoughts. So, kind of useless to have those. Okay, warfare on land in World War I. So the most common type of warfare on the land was known as trench warfare. And I don't know if you're familiar with trench warfare, but basically both sides dig a trench deep down into the earth where the soldiers are in those trenches. And they're like, if you can see that soldier right up there. Like, they kind of peer up over the edge of the trench and fire at each other across the area between the two trenches. And that area between the two trenches is called no man's land. The way you would advance, notice I use quotation marks. Well, you can't see me, but you heard the quotation marks in my voice, I hope. The way you would advance on another on either side, like either side that wanted to advance. Germany wanting to advance into France, or France wanting to advance into Germany. The way you would do that is you would get one side, so like let's say France is going to try to advance on Germany. The Allies are going to try to advance on the Central Powers. So Central Powers would start firing, trying to kill whoever they can, like firing over at the Allies' trench. Central Powers were firing, and then when their ammunition runs low because they've been firing so much, the people in the Allies' trench come out and try to charge across that no man's land. And no man's land is a barren patch of land filled with barbed wire and corpses and ammunition shells and pits from where things have hit the ground. But as a soldier, you're charging across that, and waves of soldiers, so in this case, waves of the Allies are just charging towards the Central Powers trench while they're getting mowed. People are getting mowed down left and right as they try to get across this no man's land to the other trench. And this battle, again quotation marks there, is ended when either the Allies give up or they overrun the Central Powers trench. So battles were fought like this, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives just to move the trenches a little bit. It's very sad. And that's not the only horror of the trenches. The trenches were very long. They went from the coast of Belgium, France, all the way to the edge of Switzerland, so deep into Europe. Fighting in the trenches goes on forever with very little ground gained on either side. That's kind of how they're gonna reach a stalemate, and that's basically how, because they've got trenches on either side. But not only was the fighting with the trenches horrible, but the conditions in the trenches were horrible. There were dead bodies everywhere. Trenches would fill up with rain and drown people, or the rain would create mud that would just swallow people up. There were rats and other vermin crawling all over the people. There was a bunch of disease in the trenches. There's no bathing conditions in the trenches. Trenches would be pounded by the other side, which would leave a lot of people shell-shocked. And then later on in the war, poisonous gases would be pumped into the trenches and choke people and kill people and all that fun stuff. So, yay for trench warfare! And that is an authentic picture of a trench in the World War I. So, I don't know how many of those people that you see, those bodies or people just sleeping. Alright, I'm going to go on to the next slide. The other frontiers in World War I. Neither side wanted a long, drawn-out war, and this war was less about actually beating down the other countries, like less than actually taking over another country, and more about who could last the longest, who would surrender first. And then we're going to see, trying to end this long drawn-out war, try to make it shorter, we're going to see fighting start other places. So Australia, I didn't spell that right, but that is Australia, joined the war on the side of the Allies, sort of. They wanted to gain things, so they're taking New Guinea, which was controlled by Germany at the time. The Allies start to take control of Germany's colonies in Africa. So remember, we had to scramble for Africa, and everybody had tried to lay claim to land in Africa. And all the major European countries had laid claim to some portion of land. The Great Britain had most of it. Germany had a few colonies over there, and Great Britain with France, because France had some too, they're going to take those colonies away, or do their best to take those colonies away. Japan joined on the side of the Allies. Again, they were empire building at the time, so like Australia, they saw an opening, and they joined purely to go over and take a bunch of Germany-controlled islands over in East Asia. Italy switches to the side of the Allies when the Allies promised to give them some of Austria-Hungary's land. The Ottoman Empire joined the side of the Central Powers because it wanted lands in the Balkans that it had already tried to get from the recent Balkan War, and it wanted control of the Balkan and the Dead Sea, I think. More specifically, the Balkan Sea. Right now. Not the Balkan Sea, I'm sorry, the Red Sea, or the Dead Sea. The Red Sea is that long one. They wanted the Dead Sea and the Black Sea. Specifically the Black Sea. They wanted to have full control of the Black Sea, which goes into the Mediterranean Sea. So not the Dead Sea, sorry. Black Sea. Black Sea. My bad. I get those seas over there confused in my brain. But it is the Black Sea. I know for certain it is the Black Sea now. So that's why Austria-Hungary joined, or not Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire joined, Turkey, but they didn't make really any progress, and they blamed their lack of progress on the Armenian outsiders who lived in the empire, and that sparked an Armenian genocide that killed 1.2 million people. So yay. Serbia was sort of taken out by Austria-Hungary with the help of Bulgaria. And remember, we did mention Bulgaria as a major player. They were tiny. They were a tiny country, but they really wanted more land, which Austria-Hungary promised them if they helped take out Serbia. But a lot of the Serbians got away. Portugal was drawn into the war on the side of the Allies, and Germany declared war on Portugal because Portugal was talking to Britain. Portugal was being friendly, and Germany was like, hey, I see you being friendly. War on you! So, but they didn't do a lot. And later on, after watching the war for a little bit, Romania said, I'll join, and they joined in on the side of the Allies, but they didn't do very good, so they got pounded. Greece was divided on who to help. The king wanted to support the Central Powers, while the prime minister wanted to support the Allies. So there was a brief national schism because of this. So basically, the country was fighting within itself. And the country was briefly divided into two. But then the king resigned, or abdicated the throne. And the country was reunited and then entered the war on the side of the Allies. And they did better. They actually were able to make some progress against the Central Powers, where Romania and Portugal really didn't do much, or Japan, or Australia. Italy did a little bit, but not as much either. So, go Greece! Alright, I'm gonna go on to the next slide. Germany's war plan in World War I. So they had an original plan, and then that didn't work. So then they had another plan, which still really didn't work, and then they had another plan, which still doesn't work. So, and they fail. So their original plan was known as the Schlieffen Plan, and you can see it right up there at the top of your. Let's see if I press this. Schlieffen Plan. The plan said that Germany would attack France first and conquer them before Russia could join the war, because Russia was such a big and slow country, and they thought they'd be slow to mobilize, and that once France was controlled and dealt with, Germany and Austria-Hungary would go into Russia together and take them down, because they still wouldn't have had a chance to mobilize, and everything is going to be great. This plan obviously required speed, which is why Germany refused to deal with the defensive line and go in through Belgium, but that really hurt their case, because then Great Britain got involved. Not such a smart decision there, Germany. Since that plan didn't work, and then they reached a stalemate, Germany decided to break the rules of war that had been agreed upon by all the major powers. So the major powers of Europe had met and had agreed upon basic rules of warfare. And there were just two main rules. One, no chemical warfare, and two, leave the civilians alone. So basically, don't be a jerk. And then Germany decided they were going to be jerks. By the way, also, Germany's plan didn't work because not only did they not get through France, they didn't tackle France, but Russia mobilized faster than they thought they were going to. So there's that. So To be fair to Germany, the Allies would also do some chemical warfare, less with the civilians, but they would do some chemical warfare, and um, they're gonna play dirty too. But Germany started it. Germany did Zeppelin airstrikes on British cities. So like when you hear those. Have you ever seen a movie? You've seen Peter Pan 2. I think that was. Yeah, that was during either World War I or World War II. And they've got the bombs. They're dropping the bombs. They're doing the air raids on the city. They then used chemicals to attack the Allies in the trenches, poisonous gas, and they attacked civilian ships as well. Just upstanding guys, those Germans. So the war did not make any headway until Russia pulled out of the war due to revolution. So Russia had a revolution when they overthrew their czar, partially due to the fact that a lot of people were starving because of the war, but also due to Rasputin, who was influencing the czar's wife at the time. There was a government set up after the revolution, but the government was quickly overthrown by communism. Yay. So communism is going to be a massive fear, not only in America, but we're going to see some fear of it in Europe too. That's why when the war ends, they're like, let's get these peace things ironed out real fast, because we got to focus on communism now. So Russia's out of the war. This makes the war a one-front war. So now Germany has a new plan, because right as Russia pulls out, the U.S. is like, all right, we're coming in. And Germany has a new plan with two major objectives that need to happen before U.S. soldiers can get to Europe. Because it's going to take a while to mobilize all those troops. Germany needs to overwhelm Great Britain with unrestricted naval warfare and take the capital of France. So those are the two things they've got to do before a U.S. gets to Europe, not here, gets to Europe. And they're not going to be able to do those things. So their plan is going to ultimately fail. Okay, the U.S. in World War I. Of course, originally we were neutral, and Wilson was very adamant that we remained neutral. He really didn't want to join the war. He was very anti-war. But and we're gonna look at this here. Wilson had won his election on the slogan, his second term on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." But the U.S. was in a very tight position because they had trade agreements with both France and Germany and Great Britain, and they wanted to honor those trade agreements. And plus, it helped our economy that that all these countries were buying all these war goods. It was good for us, for our economy. And we were the #1 producer of food and war goods at the time. So it was a big deal for us. But at the same time, we had a lot of immigrants in the U.S. that had ties to one of the Central Powers, generally Germany or Austria-Hungary specifically, but we had a lot of people. It was like, I think 11 million people in the U.S. that had ties, so that's a lot. Wilson issues a decree to the American people that they would be neutral in thoughts and deeds. Some very interesting language there. Deeds is obviously easy to hold, but thoughts, how's the government going to control people's thoughts? And you shouldn't want them to control your thoughts either. So there's that. It's also going to be impossible for two other main reasons, or a few other main reasons. But two big reasons, which are right there at the top. So Great Britain and France are doing a lot of propaganda, and the U.S. is seeing that propaganda. And this propaganda paints the Germans in really bad light. They're referred to as horrible monsters, or in this propaganda you can see here, this is actual U.S. propaganda from later on when we got involved, but beat back the Hun with Liberty Bonds. They were referred to as a Hun, so a barbarian that were coming in and just ravaging everything. And then Germany's doing all they can to plan the sympathy. Yeah, it's 11 million of the 11 million Americans that come from one of these Central Powers. So they're like, oh, you know, we're your mother country, and we're just trying to stand up for ourselves and support our ally, Austria-Hungary. So all that fun stuff. So we're not supplying weapons and foods and such to Germany because of the British blockade, but we were still supplying it to Great Britain, and France. So that's a sore spot with Germany. And then J.P. Morgan and several other robber barons give $2.3 million to the Allies for the war efforts. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money today. That was like a whole lot of money back then. Like, so much money back then. More money than, like, you think that's a lot now, but, like, back then that was not conceivable, really. Like, no one would really see that except in their lifetime, except for these robber barons. Gotta keep on. USA and World War I continued. Germany wanted us to remain neutral because they knew that if the U.S. officially joined the war, they would most likely fight on the side of Great Britain once Great Britain was in the war. So Germany did some stuff. Like I talked about earlier, they did the Sussex Promise to not attack any more passenger ships, to try to keep us out of the war, to try to stay on Wilson's good side. But that once the wars reached a stalemate for a while, they're going to break that promise. And then Germany, still being worried about the U.S. getting in on the war, sends a telegram, the Zimmerman telegram, to Mexico. And the telegram says, hey, Mexico, if you attack the U.S. On your border and you get them involved in a fight with you, we will give you back Texas. We will make sure that the U.S. gives you back Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico for your own country. So that was basically the straw that broke the camel's back, and we had to join in. So on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson asks Congress for a declaration of war, which they will grant a few days later. Wilson calls this war the war to end all wars. So that's where it kind of got its name from. And, they were like, oh, this is so brutal. So many people have died already. Like, no one's going to want to fight a war after this war. This will be the war to end all wars. But obviously, that is not true. That is not the case. The U.S. was coming in at a pivotal time since Russia was pulling out basically around the same time, and the war had become a one-front war. So without U.S. support, there's a huge chance that the Allies would have failed. The draft is put into place. All men 18 and older must sign up, although it is important to note that many boys would lie that they were older than they really were to join the war effort. And a thing that boys used to do is put a piece of paper on they take a piece of paper and write 18 in it and then put it in their shoe. And so they weren't actually lying when someone would ask them, are you over 18? Because they would be standing over 18 and they would say yes. So, no buyouts, as we talked about earlier, because of that Conscription Act that happened during the Civil War where people were able to avoid it. Not now. The U.S. only had 200,000 men who were trained really well and were our military force at the time. So we had to get more with the draft. The draft becomes over 4 million men strong, but it's important to note that a lot of those 4 million men that came in had little to no training. 11,000 women joined the war as nurses, communicators, and other important jobs. So secretaries, doing anything they could to help out. Even some of them would travel overseas with the men, but none of them would really fight. None of them would be in the front lines, and none of them would really fight unless they dressed as men. Of course, women were also helping over at home. We'll talk about that in a second. But that, all their help, all their work that they put into supporting their country is really going to help push the suffrage movement. June through July of 1918, the Americans start arriving in large number to Europe. And we're only going to be fighting the war for about 5 months, and our losses are going to be very small compared to everybody else's losses, everybody in Europe's losses. But we are going to kind of help crush the Central Powers. Wilson will make a speech on January 8th, 1918. It will be known as Wilson's 14 Points. The points in this speech are meant to be the cornerstones for a treaty between the countries that would come with peace. The ideas are very broad to ensure that peace happens. The few of the main key points is freedom of the seas, so no blockading and no torpedoing. That actually really pissed Wilson off that those countries were doing that. No tariffs. Wilson wanted tariffs gone, also known as economic barriers to trade. He thought everyone should want to trade, free open market. There are downfalls to that. There are just downfalls to that. And we'll probably talk about them more when we get to FDR, The end of secret alliances. So, if you're going to have an alliance, just announce it, but preferably everyone's aligned with everybody, so we won't have any more of this infighting. A reduction of arms for all. So all countries needed to reduce the amount of arms that they have. Like, no one needs all these weapons. The right to your independence for all countries. Self-determination. You get to determine what's going to happen to you, your independence, all these fun things. That's for you to decide. Respecting other countries' territory lines. No fighting over land. Like, what's established is established, and that's the way it's going to be. And then the League of Nations. That's the biggest point that Wilson is unwilling to compromise on. And that's the point that a lot of people are going to fight really hard against in the U.S. They're not going to want to be a part of the League of Nations. For the most part, his ideas were a bit too grandiose. They're not really going to come to fruition. And a lot of people do not like these points for various reasons. France was very anti-self-determination. So it's not just the U.S. that doesn't like things that Wilson's saying. The other countries are kind of like, but they're going to bow to it more than the U.S. will. And continuing on. The U.S. sees most of its action at just a few battles. The main two battles we've got here are the Second Battle of the Marne, which this battle took place during July through August of 1918. This is the last German offensive stand. This is a massive win for the Allies. The Germans were overwhelmed by Allied tanks. During this battle, there were around 50 of these tanks. And this is the beginning of the end of World War I. If you Google paintings of this, you can see the destruction that this battle wrought on the land. And it's really kind of sad, but also awe-inspiring. The second is I'm going to butcher this, Mousset-Argonne offensive. I said that with a bit too much French, because I don't think that's in a French spot. Also known as the Battle of the Argonne Forest, or the Grand Offensive. This battle took place during September 26, 1918 through November 11th, 1918. So these battles lasted months, whereas if you remember correctly, most of the battles in the Civil War only lasted several days, and they thought that was a long time. So this is a whole new style of fighting. The objective of this battle was to cut German rail lines so they couldn't get supplies anymore. The American forces in this battle are led by General Pershing. If you remember him from our lesson last week, he's the one that went after the Mexican outlaw that killed Americans on American soil. This is the Villa Pancho. Yeah, him. This is the bloodiest single battle in U.S. history still today. Almost 100,000 American men are lost during this battle. This is also the first time the Browning automatic rifle is used. Browning's a big name in guns, even still today. This is a massive win for the Allies. It ends up with the Germans retreating. The biggest U.S. name to come out of this battle is Alvin C. York. He gets the Medal of Honor for his work in this battle. He single-handedly kills 20 Germans and takes 132 of them as prisoner of war. Single-handedly! You can look him up. He becomes an actor later in the golden days of Hollywood, or the early golden days of Hollywood. So, continue on. Effects at home during World War I, and when I say at home, I mean in the U.S. So once all the men were sent off to war, the women became major players in the war. They filled lots of jobs the men had left behind. Another effect of the war were wages were doubled. Unfortunately, the price of goods were also doubled. So when the price of your wages goes up, the price of goods go up. I think I mentioned that at the start of the lesson. If people fight for a increase in the minimum wage, if we get that increase, the price of goods will also increase. So the livable wage will no longer be a livable wage. It's just it'll be a constant uptick in how much you're paid and then how much things cost. And we don't really want that. The U.S. economy was doing really well due to all the order for war supplies. However, goods were becoming limited due to all these supplies having to be made and sent overseas. So due to things becoming limited, one of the things Wilson did in response was create the Food Administration and put Herbert Hoover in charge. He's going to be a future president. Hoover starts calling for people to be more aware of what they're eating, to eat less of the goods that can make trips overseas. He calls for days such as meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, so no wheat on Wednesdays, no meat on Mondays. He also called for people to start their own farms or gardens, mini farms. These farms or gardens are also known as victory gardens. They are known as victory gardens, not farms. I don't know why I put farms there so much. We're going to see this be really popular during World War II. Another thing that was used to help the troops was the purchase of Liberty bonds. That was money given to the U.S. to help fund their war efforts. We talked about that at the beginning of the lesson. Once the U.S. enters the war, it is important that all the people of the U.S. be behind the war. That means all the propaganda. As you can see here, you saw in that other image a little bit ago. Wilson creates the Committee of Public Information to ensure this propaganda is good at its job and is widespread. So that committee was supposed to push this propaganda. The committee is led by a man named George Creel. Wilson is also so determined to get everyone to support his 14 points in the League of Nations. To accomplish Wilson's two goals for support of the war and his 14 points, we see two acts passed. The Espionage Act in 1917, no spying, and the Sedition Act in 1918, which nothing saying no, it's right there, what exactly the act laid out. No publishing or saying or doing anything that is counterproductive to America's effort in this war. The socialist Eugene Debs is arrested under this act. At the end of World War I, the Central Powers start to drop like flies once the U.S. gets in the war. First Bulgaria falls, then the Ottoman Empire falls, then Austria-Hungary falls, and finally Germany surrenders. Then we have Armistice Day, also known over here as Veterans Day. That's how we celebrate the war ending today. On November 11th, 1918, at 11 a.m., the armistice is signed. Wilson is a major player in this armistice. He is leading the peace talks based on his 14 points. He's seen as a moral leader of the world in Europe. He's big in Europe. They really like him. The U.S. is starting to not like him so much, and they're like, hey, no. People didn't like that he went to Europe for the peace talks. People were really unhappy that there was no Republican representative during the peace talks. Remember, the War for Independence, for American independence, was based around taxation without representation. We've gotten used to having representatives for everything now, and he kind of broke that by not having a Republican representative during peace talks. Henry Cabot Lodge is going to push back against most of Wilson's plans and ideas once he comes back to the U.S. The ending treaty to end the war is the Treaty of Versailles, because they met in the Versailles Palace, if you're familiar with that. It's a very elaborate, beautiful palace that was built for the Sun King. Well, not specifically for him, but he made it what it is today. And they met in the Hall of Mirrors, which is a grand room filled with mirrors. You can look it up. It's very beautiful. The number one goal of Wilson is the League of Nations. This will happen with the countries of Europe. However, the U.S. will not support it. Wilson goes on a tour to try to promote the treaty in the League of Nations, but it's still not successful. Henry Cabot Lodge makes changes to the treaty that Wilson hates, and he refuses to support it. Wilson will never get to see the treaty ratified in the U.S., as the treaty is never agreed upon, so Germany has very shaky peace. Germany and U.S. do. Harding is going to win the 1920 election while running on the platform of no League of Nations and a return to normalcy. And the treaty is going to end up making Germany bitter as well. So the treaty as a whole, even what was agreed in Europe, especially what was agreed in Europe with how Germany would be handled and what Germany had to do, is going to make Germany bitter, and it's going to be used to help spark World War II. Okay, and then we have women's rights and suffrage. Women's rights for equal rights, women's fight for equal rights started long before the 1900s. If you'll remember, we've talked about some of these things last year in class in American History 1. We talked about Abigail Adams, John Adams' wife, like kind of rebuking him for wanting to fight for America to have its independence, but not fight for women to have their independence too and their rights. And then in this class this year, well, not specifically this year, but in American History 2, we talked about the Seneca Women's Rights Convention that was headed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, where they had the Declaration of Sentiments that said all men and women are created equal. In 1848, the women's rights movement, the women's suffrage movement, got pushed aside due to the Civil War and civil rights. Then we had the 15th Amendment that was proposed, and this actually split the movement into two. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton opposed the 15th Amendment as it did not address women's rights to vote, and they wanted an amendment that would grant women the right to vote as well as black men. These women founded the National Women's Suffrage Association. Other supporters of women's suffrage, such as Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, supported the 15th Amendment and fought to get the women's rights to vote at a state level. Sorry, that was a tongue twister. Rather than a national level, they formed the American Women's Suffrage Association. I'm sorry I'm going so fast. I'm trying not to go over for too long. So if you need to pause at any point or come back to any of these slides, of course, this lesson will remain up here online. And you'll have the link to it. In 1878, an amendment to the Constitution written by Susan B. Anthony was presented, but it was defeated on the Senate floor in 1887. In 1890, the two different sides of the women's suffrage movement merged and became the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And they started to work together. And women did receive the right to vote in 4 states by 1896. And those 4 states were Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. I think Wyoming was the first one to give women the right to vote. Black women wanted to get in on the action of fighting for the right to vote as well, and they founded the National Association of Colored Women around 1900. That movement was led by Mary Church Terrell, Josephine Sloan Yates, and Anna Julia Cooper. The movement ramped up around 1910 and showed no hint of slowing down. Women fighting for the right to vote were holding marches, parades, and picketing at the White House and other government buildings. In 1912, 15,000 suffragette supporters took to the streets of New York City for a march. In 1913, the women fighting for suffrage marched on Washington, led by Inez Milholland and Alice Paul. The march was massive and included floats and performances of great women throughout history. The march was not without its dangers, as over 100 women had to be hospitalized due to protesters to their march assaulting them and burning them by throwing cigars at them. The police did not intervene much at all. This mistreatment of women did help the movement, however. It helped them get more notice. The media took the story and ran with it, and it got them a lot of sympathy, so a lot more people started to support the movement, and it just continued to grow. In 1917, women were protesting outside the White House often, trying to fight for the right to vote. In November of 1917, 33 women picketing outside the White House were arrested. This included one of the suffragette movement leaders, Alice Paul. A lot of the women were beaten by some of the police officers who had arrested them, and Alice Paul was put in solitary confinement where she went on a hunger strike. And then while she was on the hunger strike, she was force-fed. And she was force-fed by being held down with her head parallel to the ground and a tube shoved down her nose and liquid food poured down the tube. Sorry if that disturbed you with how graphic it was. The press coverage of the women's treatment increased the support for them, so the support's just continuing to grow by their horrible treatment. And in 1918, Representative Jeanette Rankin, which we mentioned earlier in the lesson, was the first female representative, brought forth a resolution for women's suffrage to the House. The resolution did fail, however. This did not stop the movement. President Woodrow Wilson came out in favor of women's suffrage in 1918. He used the war to back up the need for women having the right to vote, even though other presidents, especially Teddy Roosevelt, strongly supported the movement as well. Things often stalled at Congress. In 1919, finally, the federal women's suffrage amendment that had been written by Susan B. Anthony was passed. On August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was officially added to the Constitution, meaning that states could no longer deny anyone the right to vote based on gender. However, Native Americans still did not have the right to vote, and Asian Americans had a lot of restriction on their rights to vote. More than 900 women voted during the 1920 election, and they voted for a Republican president. And it's important to note that it was more Republican, even though Wilson was a Democrat. It was Republicans that the women tended to favor at this time, and they supported women's suffrage as well, about as much as the Democrats did. It was kind of split. So, a side note, the men and women who supported suffrage were white, yellow, and purple. They didn't just wear white, which you see a lot of people today saying, oh, I'm wearing white to support the women from women's suffrage, but they actually did wear yellow and purple as well. Anti-suffrage people wore red. The 19th Amendment was passed by an anti who switched at the last minute, Harry Byrne, due to a letter from his mother telling him to hurry up and vote for suffrage. And I'm going to leave a link in the description down below, and again, I know this link will be there. I have this video primed and ready to be linked to, and I'd really like for you to watch it. I think you will enjoy it. It is an excellent video about women's suffrage that kind of shows all the things that the women had to go through. All right, our last slide. This is a comparison of the Gilded Age versus the Progressive Era. And so on one side we have what main points of the Gilded Age, and then on the other side we have main points from the Progressive Era, and the points are about the same thing. So in the Gilded Age, governments supported to a certain extent big business. Remember, they were more laissez-faire, they were more hands-off, no regulations. In the Progressive Era, the government does not support big business and starts to regulate it and really control what's happening with big businesses. In the Gilded Age, we had a lot of government scandals. In the Progressive Era, not so much. I mean, there was still the issue with Teddy and Taft, their kind of squabble, but it was nothing like what we had with the Gilded Age. Then, in the Gilded Age, labor unions were often smacked down, not supported, bad. In the Progressive Era, labor unions were supported more when they were reasonable and not super aggressive. In the Gilded Age, we had the Sherman Antitrust Act passed. That was a weak act and was used more against labor unions rather than the big businesses during the Gilded Age. During the Progressive Era, the Sherman Antitrust Act is used against large businesses until the Clayton Antitrust Act, which was a strong antitrust act and could not be used against labor unions. War is huge during the Gilded Age. We had the Spanish-American War happen. War is not as popular and as the last measure during the Progressive Era. We did have Teddy policy of speak softly and carry a big stick, but we didn't have a big war until World War I, and we put off getting into that as long as possible, whereas with the Spanish-American War, we kind of jumped into war without just cause. We're very much war. Yellow journalism was huge during the Gilded Age, even though there were muckrakers around at the time. We talked about the one that exposed Boss Tweed in New York. They don't have center stage like yellow journalism did. In the Progressive Era, we have less yellow journalism, kind of fake news almost, and we've got more muckrakers being front and center and celebrated, and writers having more influence. Because if you remember, during the Gilded Age, we had Mark Twain, who had a lot of comments on society at the time, but he wasn't really listened to. He was very anti-Spanish-American War. in the progressive era, we have people listening, like Sinclair's The Jungle, and people listen to that. Even though he didn't really intend for it to be all about the meat, it was. In the Gilded Age, there wasn't really much in the way of women's suffrage. In the progressive era, women get their suffrage. Both ages, there were no strides forward with civil rights. In the Gilded Age, robber barons controlled much of the U.S. In the progressive era, the robber barons had less control. In the Gilded Age, industrialization is super important. In the progressive era, industrialization is still very important. So there are some similarities, and then there are some changes. So it's important to note those. In the Gilded Age, the government was not fair. People could not vote for their senators, and people, especially immigrants, were pushed to vote for certain people. If you remember Boss Tweed's scandal in New York, where he was controlling people and getting them to vote for him. In the progressive era, the government becomes more fair. We have the 17th Amendment, which allows people to vote for their senators, and vote to become a secret ballot. So your vote is no longer public. You don't walk up and tell people who you're voting for and things like that. You have a secret ballot like we do today. In the Gilded Age, child labor was common and popular. In the progressive era, there are child labor laws, and child labor has gone down. In the Gilded Age, horrible working conditions / hours, and in the progressive era, we have working conditions and hours being more regulated and being more fair to the workers. So that's a comparison of the Gilded Age and the progressive era. We have a test next week that I will be emailing to you. This week I'm going to email the study guide, and I'll also send out an email with homework. If you have any questions, you can email me, but I'd prefer if you left them in a comment on the side. But if you don't feel comfortable doing that, go ahead and email me. I know I kind of flew through the last bit of this lesson. I was trying to get us under an hour 30, or right at an hour 30. We've gone over a little bit, but not too much. Thank you so much for being here, class, and keep an eye out for that homework email, and I will talk to you later. Bye.